Welcome to In the Spotlight. I'm Abigail Pogrebin. Joshua Leifer is a journalist, editor, and translator. His essays and reporting have appeared widely in international publications, including the New York Times, the New York Review of Books, The Atlantic, The Guardian, The New Statesman, Haaretz, The Nation, and elsewhere. A member of the Dissent editorial board, he previously worked as an editor at Jewish Currents and at 972 magazine. He is currently pursuing a PhD at Yale University, where he studies the history of modern moral and social thought. His first book, which we are going to talk about today, is called Tablets Shattered: The End of an American Jewish Century and the Future of Jewish Life. It was published in August 2024 to great fanfare. Welcome, Joshua, to the broadcast. It's good to be with you, even though we're not together.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, I would have loved to come into the studio, but I couldn't make it, unfortunately.
And I know you're flying to Israel, your new home tonight, and we'll talk about that decision that you and your wife made to move there in the last year. Let's just start with the book launch, because you had a very, I think, unexpected maelstrom in the press, which is that essentially you were supposed to speak at a bookstore and were suddenly barred from entering because of who was going to be your interviewer, your interlocutor, Rabbi Andy Bachman, a friend of mine. Can you tell those who might have missed it, by some miracle, what happened?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I've been, as the months since the book launch have gone on, I've said, I thought this book was going to kind of go under the radar. And if it wasn't for the spontaneous decision of a bookstore clerk who, I guess, didn't know who Rabbi Bachman was and looked him up last minute, basically an hour before we were scheduled to have the event at the bookstore in Dumbo, and said he's a Zionist and we don't want a Zionist on the bookstore stage. And so the conversation that we had planned, that I had been planned to have with him, and that the bookstore had actually signed off on, wasn't going to be able to go forward. And then from there,
before you go but exploded. For those who don't know, Rabbi Andy Bachman was the senior rabbi at CBE, Congregation Beth Elohim in Park Slope, for many years. Really beloved by his congregation, although sometimes his politics created some flashpoints, but certainly someone who eminently capable of a really smart and balanced interview. And were they aware of your politics when they barred you from the door?
I don't know to what extent they were aware of my politics. I mean, I think that had they read the book in total, they would have realized that a bar on Andy, one, wasn't something that I was going to play ball with, and two, that Andy and I have disagreements on some things, but we also have agreements on a lot of other things. And at the end of the day, a place where he can't be is also a place where I can't be. I do wonder what they thought when they read the book, because it's very upfront. We'll get into this. The book is very upfront about what I call my implication and my involvement in all the things that I criticize, whether it's Israeli politics or the American Jewish mainstream. That's where I come from, and also where I've spent a lot of my adult life. And so I thought it was very clear in the book itself, but
maybe they missed it.
I don't know.
And before we get to the book itself, what was the outcome after that was recorded? By the way, I listened to that recording of the clerk saying we basically don't want Zionists on our stage, kind of an unfathomable sentence. But anyone can hear it if they want to retrace those steps. But then obviously you did do an event. Just tell us how that all played out.
Yeah, I mean, we did a makeup event a week later at the Center for New Jewish Culture, which is, I think, part of CBE, and the crowd was huge, around 300 people. So if the goal, I don't know what the goal of that store employee was, but the effect was to put this book more in the spotlight than I ever really thought it would be.
And even though we're sort of chuckling about it, it does get at sort of a moment we're in. we're policing each other in ways that I think are destructive, and ultimately have outcomes of shutting down the voices we actually need to hear. Let's go to the book, Shattered Tablets, The End of an American Jewish Century and the Future of Jewish Life. It's a big subtitle. First, the idea for the book, and then I want to get into explaining a little bit of your Jewish bio so people understand.
Sure. I mean, the book emerged in the beginning as an attempt to take stock of what had happened to American Jewish life and what I like to call the long Trump years. I mean, we're not out of them, unfortunately, but basically starting kind of from 2015 through the pandemic in 2020, it had seemed to me that a lot had changed in American Jewish life and that there was an opportunity to take stock of some of that. As I wrote, the argumentative charge of the book gradually took shape, and the basic argument that I try to make is that most of what we know about most of what we think about as American Jewish culture and identity really took shape after the big wave of Jewish migration to the United States has basically ended. So from 1880 roughly to 1924. Something like more than 2 million European Jews, mainly from Eastern and Central Europe, come to America. They make their homes there. In 1924, the United States adopts immigration restrictions that close off essentially Jewish immigration. And in the intervening century between 1924 and 2024, the kind of canonical features of American Jewish culture took shape, but not just culture. What I argue in the book, that's also when the pillars of American Jewish identity and political consensus that I think governed American Jewish life for a long time also took shape. And we can get into it in the rest of our conversation, but I argue in the book that consensus was comprised of 3 pillars. One was Americanism, one was Zionism, and one was liberalism. Americanism took shape the earliest. And by Americanism, I mean a certain kind of American Jewish exceptionalism, the idea that America is an exceptionally good country based on its treatment, as confirmed by its treatment of Jews. First, because of its remarkable openness compared to Europe at home, and then later because of the position America takes as the guardian of Israel on the world stage and Jewish people's interests, more broadly. This is true from the 60s to the 80s with the issue of Soviet Jewry. The second pillar is Zionism, and I don't actually mean the thing that everyone's debating right now, and that that got in the way of the book event. By Zionism and the American Jewish intra-communal conversation, I mean 2 things. One, the idea that Israel represents the culmination of all of Jewish history beginning from the reception of the Torah onward, that it was all going to culminate in this state. And 2, that Israel is a moral exemplar and an example in miniature of the values that American Jews hold most dear. It's a reflection of them. So that's the Zionism pillar. And then the third pillar, liberalism. I don't actually mean political liberalism, but I mean a liberal way of thinking about religion in which the individual, instead of, say, the communal unit, is kind of the way in that people have to religious practice. People think about how they engage with religion as a matter of choice, rather than, say, a more orthodox, halachically committed framework of saying there's a divine command here. And then a certain kind of non-judgmentalness or pluralism, even maybe, and I argue, verging on a kind of relativism in which American Jews aren't able to give reasons for why it's worth living a Jewish life instead of, say, other kinds of ways of life that might be on offer.
So, and you said that's kind of like almost like the me orientation of like, what's it doing for me, and not so much a sense of like, do I say why I light Shabbat candles? Can I say why I had this bris for my son?
Exactly. They're all related. In academic terms, the individualism, the voluntarism, and the relativism all connect to each other. And it is exactly what you said, because and this isn't a Jewish problem uniquely. It's a feature of religious life, say in the West, but basically people don't really feel like they can give reasons for why they engage in religious practice beyond it makes me feel good or I like it. And I think that left Jewish communities in a very perilous position as time went on, not just in terms of continuity. I try to avoid the whole continuity conversation in the book because it's been a bit played out, but it puts them on unsteady ground because it's very hard to sustain a thick community when you can't explain why you're doing what you're doing.
And that's particularly alive for us now post October 7th. I know you wrote this book before October 7th. You adjusted certain parts because of those horrific events. But we are seeing now, in a way, the cost of, I'll use the word flimsy Jewish reasons. Like if you don't kind of have the scaffolding of why you do what you do as a Jew, sometimes you can easily be blown by the winds, particularly, I would say, my children's generation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, and this is something I get into the book a little bit, I think this problem is especially acute maybe for people who grew up in what I call the affiliated mainstream of American Jewish life, which is that, and what I mean by that is that we received an education which puts us in an exceptional position vis-a-vis the broader sociology of American Jewry itself, in which very few people, so like demographically, are members of synagogues or walk through these institutions. But the nature of that education was, as you said, was very flimsy. And it wasn't, to borrow language from the French philosopher Emmanuel Levinas, it wasn't a religion for adults. And so when people of my age bracket, I think, reached their early adulthood, there wasn't very much that could be incorporated from our educations into a mature worldview in which, we're people who take politics very seriously. We take the causes we're committed to very seriously. As many years as day school education as some of the people I know had, Judaism and Jewishness and practice and observance and texts never received the same kind of intellectual mature treatment as all of those other things that we care about in our lives.
So you were actually concerned, I read, that some Jewish organizations and synagogues were not going to actually even invite you to talk about this book. That they're so allergic to anything that feels like we're being very simplistic here, a left-wing point of view, and particularly post this massacre, that they don't even want to hear it. And I'm just, before we get to kind of your arc, which has been very interesting and not at all a straight line, have you seen that kind of shutting down? Are people like, I don't even want to engage this book at all? I think in part because of the nature of the book launch, it got put on people's radar, and then because of the association with Andy, or Rabbi Bachman, many more people started to reach out to me than I had expected. And in fact, it's like he gave you a lecture.
He did. I think getting canceled, quote unquote, in that way gave me a hecture. I mean, it made me trafe for much of the left. Which is
That's
funny.
That's an unusual position for you.
It is,
to
right.
be canceled by the left.
Right. I mean, I think that it's certainly not all of the left, of course. And I think one of the challenges of this time is that the most extreme voices can easily get amplified on social media, and it's very easy to take them as representative of something broader. I happen to think that even if there are some, very strident voices, and I'm not minimizing those voices, their existence on the left that have, devolved into conspiratorial anti-Semitism. I don't think they represent everyone. And I mean, but as you note, there is a real irony here, which is that the book is a strident, and I would even say contains an even foundational critique of the existing Israeli political system. And it's very, very critical of Israel's occupation, and it's critical of Israel's conduct of the war. I think that criticism not only was right then. I think my fears and my anxieties about the conduct of the war have been proven correct, as we see the images that we see coming out right now of the northern West Bank and what the army is doing in Jabalia. I think that one of the saddest parts of the experience of the last year or so is that for someone like me who came from the political left and was writing for publications like 972 and then Jewish Currents, a lot of what we were warning about has happened. That there was a sentiment rising in the Israeli public that the only way to deal with the Palestinian problem was to carry out a second Nakba. I mean, this is something that people were saying on TV, in Israeli TV.
Who was saying?
Dromi. Like, these are people on mainstream television who were saying this back in 2021, and now it's again, like, the frustrating thing is, like, we warned this, we were shouted down, we were ignored, and then the things happen, and then so that whole experience has been very, very demoralizing. Obviously, it's also been demoralizing to have the kind of criticism come from the left, because I'm not willing to say that Israelis should be thrown into the sea and that Jews have no right to collective self-determination.
So just to establish kind of the ground game here.
Yes.
And I know you've been asked it, but I think it's helpful for this audience.
Yes.
Do you call yourself a Zionist today?
So that's a great question. And I mean, we can get into, if Zionism means the right of Jews to collective self-determination, then I'm a Zionist. If Zionism means occupation and the subjugation of the Palestinians, then I can't be a Zionist. I mean, I think, I saw there was the Rabbi Amiel Hirsch speech went
Stephen Wise.
Went viral. Yeah, Stephen, went viral a little bit. I think it was last week or the week before. And that speech, as much as I was able to understand where he was, coming from, it dismayed me, because I think that he gave his opponents, and some of whom are also my opponents, a get out of jail free card, so to speak.
Why?
Because
first off, for those who might have missed it, because I think we actually broadcast it on JBS. People can find it, but can you, on one sentence, kind of give the thrust of it?
My sense of what he was saying was that, and I didn't grow up in the Reform movement, so I'm ventriloquizing what he was saying here. That we taught you the values of social justice and tikkun olam, but we didn't. He's saying this to what he sees as a kind of overwhelming left-wing alumni of various young reform institutions, but we failed to teach you. We didn't think you would betray your people, and I think that I reject the phrasing or the framing of social justice with commitment to the Jewish people. I think we have to make the argument that these things are compatible, not give up on it. And I think if there's a fight that I'm trying to wage, both against the extreme left, but also some people like Rabbi Hirsch, it's to say, no, I'm not ready to give up on the compatibility of Jewish self-determination and justice. I believe they can be compatible. They're not currently compatible on the ground empirically, but just because something is happening right now, it doesn't mean that can't change.
But let me just push back for a second, and I don't,
sure.
and I know Ami a bit, and I'm not going to channel him, but I would say that he has often spoken about how it's not that tikkun olam should be kicked to the curb, it's that the orientation of that somehow derailed something else.
Right, but I think that goes back to my critique of these institutions that are in the book. I don't think that's a problem of education. It's not a problem of values. It's certainly possible to educate people to understand that Jewish self-determination should and can be just. But saying to them, these values that we taught, hold off on them or suspend them when you think about this place being Israel, I think that I'm very opposed to that approach.
And Joshua, you're obviously speaking, the values and the discomfort that many people in their 20s and 30s are feeling right now and beyond it. But I know it's unfair to sort of throw at you what you can imagine the reaction is of many people whom I run with in various places. But post October 7th, it is very hard to find the same kind of expansiveness of shared society and two-state solutions and not shared humanity. Hopefully we haven't lost our value of everyone being made in the image of God. But you do have a people that essentially, burned our families and raped our sisters and obviously, atrocities I don't even want to list here. And so it feels like, what world are you living in? How do your values endure with the reality of that kind of hatred and threat?
Sure. I mean, the first thing I'll say is that I hold Hamas responsible for those atrocities, but I don't hold Palestinians as a whole responsible for the atrocities. I don't hold even Gazans as a whole for the atrocities, and I don't think we should. I think that kind of reasoning where we look at a political force or a political leadership that's operating, even if they might have some modicum of democratic or support or legitimacy, and then hold the entire people responsible for what they did. I would reject. I think many of us would reject being told that we bear the same responsibility for the actions that, say, Netanyahu or Bezalel Smotrich or Itamar Ben-Gvir did. That, and so so that's one thing. I reject that reasoning. The second is, it's okay for it to be hard because most things that are important and worth doing are hard. And the Jewish tradition is not one that says you should only do things that are easy. It is very hard to maintain even keel when, say, people you love are in danger. But that leads me to my third way of thinking about this, which is that there isn't, I happen to think, and that it's a moral imperative to hold on to the humanity of everybody. But if there are people who are listening to this who find that hard, I would also make an appeal to them on the grounds of Jewish safety, which is that there is no way that Israel and Israelis are going to be able to live in long-term peace as long as the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza continues. And so if you are invested in an Israel that lives in peace, then there is no other option.
Okay.
But to maintain a commitment to this. I mean, so far I would turn it back on the people who are arguing for other ways. How does this end in their eyes? What's the end game? So no one has any, as far as I know, no one has any answers. And I've been on lots of podcasts and TV shows recently, and I hear arguments either for, well, just maintaining the status quo indefinitely, but that is to accept that we'll have to live by the sword indefinitely. And I think that that's certainly not the future that I would want for the people I love in Israel, and it's certainly not a just one in terms of what it means for Palestinians.
And when people say, what would you have wanted, Joshua, on October 8th to happen?
I thank God that I'm not in a position of power where I would have to make a decision on what would happen on October 8th. But I think that my sense would have been to do a hostage exchange immediately. That would be the first thing. Israel can go in anytime it wants if it feels the need and deal with Hamas as a military force. But the fact is that when at the beginning of this war, Netanyahu announced two goals that everyone knew were impossible to achieve simultaneously: the defeat of Hamas and the return of the hostages. We're a year out, and more hostages have been killed by Israeli fire than they have been saved by Israeli operations. And that's partially due to the nature of the conditions under which they're being held in Gaza, and the condition, and that's on Hamas, and that's Hamas's responsibility as well. But if your priority would be to save lives, that was the first step that I would have done.
And assuming that there would have been a deal to be made.
I think there would have been a deal to be made. but it's not the language of strength versus strength. And I think that language has gotten us into trouble. I mean, if I were really going to be king for a day, then I'd have also a more expansive agenda of saying, the horror of October 7th should be a wake-up call that the status quo of endless occupation cannot continue. And I would have, if I were prime minister, would have begun a process, re-entered a process to leave the West Bank and Gaza. I know that sounds like a utopian fantasy, but I also think it's a utopian fantasy to imagine that the current situation, where the way it is now, can be sustained in the long term.
And I know I'm channeling all the things that we could debate, but I want to make sure we get back to the book and to you.
Sure.
So I'm sure we'll touch on these again. But just in terms of your bio, because I think I was surprised by how much Jewish education you'd had, and that you've also married someone from the Lakewood world. So between
yes.
that also has taken you in an interesting direction, and you've decided to move to Israel for a year. Am I correct about that? Or it's not clear how long? It's sort of open-ended?
It's open-ended. I mean, we can work backwards. I mean, I met my wife, Shani, in Israel, actually. She lived there for her entire adult life. And we were connected through mutual friends who were involved in the Israeli left-wing activist scene. And the plan was always, I was actually going to go join her there, but for various family circumstances, she ended up coming here for almost 2 years. And we had been planning, the way that all of this got phrased was that I was abruptly leaving in light of the political circumstances in the United States. And that's not true, because we had been planning to go back for long before all of this happened. There are personal as well as ideological reasons for that, which is that I think that if you care about the future of Jewish self-determination, then the fight over what it's going to look like is happening in Israel much more than it is happening in the US. In the US, we kind of deal with the meta discourse about it. Like, can you say this or can you say that? Or should you think this or should you think that? But like, it's real over there, which isn't to say that there's no political work to happen
here
in America, but it wasn't the kind of thing that she or I have been connected to. And then, it is true. One of the things that I think is always a source of frustration, I'll be honest, for me, is that, and this is true, like, there are a lot of left-wing Jews who don't come from the same kind of background as me, but there is often assumption that if you are left-wing, then you came from a kind of disaffiliated or unaffiliated background. And that's certainly not the social milieu I run in, which is basically people who grew up in what I call the mainline affiliated Jewish world, or even, people who grew up more Orthodox. I didn't grow up Orthodox, but people who grew up Orthodox and found their ways into different paths. That's been the more comfortable place where I've spent a lot of my time. But yeah, I grew up in a day school community in northern New Jersey and attended a Solomon Schechter for the first 8 years of my education. I spent summers in Israel. I spent a year in a pre-military academy in Israel. And so for me, the fight over the meaning of Jewish life in that place has basically been a constitutive one for me as a young adult. And I talk about this journey in the book. It's kind of the personal story that's interwoven through the first half or so.
Yeah, it's part of the personal makes, all of the politics just feel like they are much more alive for you on a daily basis. In terms of just the arc of your activism, like, were you kind of right out of the gate feeling a disappointment in terms of what Israel had become? Was that something that you got at your kitchen table? Give us a sense of that.
So I grew up with a very strong sense of identification with Israel. I mean, the day school community I grew up in was unique, I think, among other day school communities, in that it was it was strongly believed in a bilingual Hebrew education. And I left that community with a very strong Hebrew foundation. And it was also full of Israelis. I mean, it was where, say, the Jewish agency Shlichim sent their children. So it was a very Israeli environment. All the teachers were Israeli. I did not grow up with criticism of Israel being part of my environment at all. And in fact, part of my political journey, which is, this is kind of how Tablet Shattered begins, started with just asking questions that weren't able to be asked. And being a curious kid, I went out and looked for them on my own. One of the, I think, maybe unique or ironies of my own situation is that the more you search for the answers, the more you actually get brought in close to it. So the more I'm going to Israel and looking and trying to understand, the more I'm actually spending time in Israel and becoming, I think, part of communities there, even if there are communities that are also very critical of what Israel is doing. And so
what was your first kind of like professional iteration of this?
Professional iteration?
As a journalist, you were writing?
I graduated college in 2017 and went to work at 972 magazine, which is a joint Israeli-Palestinian web magazine. 972 refers, of course, to the country code that applies both to Israel and the occupied territories. And I worked there for a year. It was the first sort of intensive reporting I had done as a journalist, and I still write for them from time to time. But during that year, I was sent on assignment deep into the West Bank. I covered home demolitions and the violent suppression of protests. I also covered the struggle over the fate of the Darfurian Eritrean asylum seekers, of whom there were roughly 30,000 in Israel during that time. And that was something I also reported on very extensively. And then I came back to the States and ended up taking a job at Dissent magazine and then moved to Jewish Currents when it started. I was one of the early paid employees of full-time employees at Currents in the winter of 2020.
And what was your inner circle or your family? How are they reacting to kind of your political metamorphosis? I mean, was there a lot of pushback? Were there constant arguments? Or were you kind of in a world in which you were finding that everyone was waking up in the same way that you were to certain facts on the ground that you felt were untenable?
That was certainly not the case for a long time in my family, and those years were years of fairly strident arguments, some of which are recounted in the book.
That's why I mentioned them.
And I mean, I think in that way, like that, my experience was not so unique for my generational cohort.
No, but part of what I want to get at is that what you describe is kind of what's verboten in institutional Jewish life about expressing misgivings or disquiet about the status quo. And maybe that's where you want to expound a little more.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I often think about what had happened if the institutions that I grew up in had been accepting of criticism, if they had just said, that's a valid position to hold, or even without saying I agree, or of saying, there are all of these other Israelis who agree with you. Look at Haaretz, look at Shalom Achshav. Like, these aren't beyond the pale opinions. I think that the terrain of American Jewish politics might have looked much different than it does today. I mean, an important moment in the book, less for my life, but I think it was politically significant, was the rejection of J Street by the Conference of Presidents. Now, the Conference of Presidents is not an organization that most American Jews know what it is and know what it does, but it was important in a symbolic way because that rejection basically said, even J Street, which is very explicit about being pro-Israel, which has worked very hard to remain within the lines of acceptable opinion, is beyond the pale. They're outside the tent, and because the parameters of the discourse were so limited, I think it pushed out a lot of people who maybe weren't really looking to leave, especially, and that experience of rejection and silencing is also a radicalizing one. And I think that certainly maybe the first wave of anti-occupation youth-led Jewish protests that I chronicle in the book, with the emergence of organizations like If Not Now, or the revitalization of ones like Jewish Voice for Peace, I think that all happens at the same in roughly around the same time period. J Street's exclusion, but also J Street having to play an inside game in the American Jewish community and not being able to be a kind of more prophetic voice.
Because I know many on the left are critical of J Street now.
Right. I mean, now the discourse has shifted substantially. And I also think this is maybe too insidery for a wider audience. I also think J Street changed what they wanted to do. J Street has become a very powerful political operation in terms of its Capitol Hill work. That kind of retail politics isn't the right word, but that kind of politics is very different from a kind of, to use the word again, prophetic moral leadership politics that can be directly confrontational with, the powers that be, because there are people who have to get elected, and so the business is a little bit different.
So when you were at this height, let's talk before October 7th, and whenever you felt like there was kind of a groundswell happening in your ideological camp, what was working? What did you think? What do you think was resonating and actually taking on a kind of positive momentum?
What do you mean, like rhetorically, or?
No, I think was it effective? Was Currents having an effect? Was 972 having an effect? Were you changing minds? I mean, you talk many times in the book about actually wanting to impact people's thinking. Was that happening?
Not the people I wanted to reach, I think, in large part. I mean, one of the kinds of, as I have done a cheshbon nefesh in the last year, one of the things I've thought a lot about is whether the language that I used was always necessary, and if it and sometimes pushed away people that I wanted to reach. I mean, I think that I would like to think that in my writing, I described the truth, I described reality, and I was trying to convey the often brutal nature of the occupation to an audience that didn't want to hear it. But I think there were certainly times in retrospect, or there's certainly things in retrospect that I would have written differently now. And I think that it's very easy when you see injustice to become, enraged, on fire with the desire to rectify that injustice. But and in some sense, politics can be in a moral game, and the role of a journalist or an activist is to bridge these two worlds between strategy and moral outrage, because moral outrage has to be channeled into strategic channels in order to be effective. And when it comes to changing the American Jewish community, I certainly don't, and I'm only speaking about myself and for myself here, I don't think that I was effective as I would have liked to have been. I also think, in some sense, reality was doing the work more than I was doing. I mean, if we can remember before October 7th, with the judicial overhaul that the Netanyahu government was trying to carry out, there was unprecedented criticism from the people with the most mainstream Jewish characteristics. And I think, who knows what would have happened had October 7th not happened. I mean, all that being said, just because it's hard doesn't mean I've given it up. And I think something that the reception of the book, something encouraging about the reception of the book has been a rediscovery, I think, of people who are willing to hear and are interested again. And I've been very heartened by the Jewish communal response to the book, which seems, I've said this a few times and I think it is true. I think people, on the one hand, are feeling scared and afraid in the U.S. and also because of what's happening in Israel. But I also think that if you ask a lot of American Jews if they are proud of how Israel is conducting the war, they would say that they're not, and they would say that they're ashamed. And holding on to those two things is is basically finds very little organizational representation and very little public representation in our discourse today.
Can you at least touch on why you left Currents and why, I don't know if it was either the discourse or the response to October 7th was a bridge too far for you?
Sure. I mean, this got covered in a New Yorker article that, I think people can read if they want to get the full story. I mean, I have some qualms about the representations there. I mean, in short, I left Currents shortly after October 7th because I could not be part of a publication that was airing, that included people who celebrated what happened. This was a values decision. I thought that we were committed to a critique of violence. We were opposed to the killing of civilians, and in that moment, it was revealed to me that an unequivocal position, say on the opposition to killing civilians, was not shared by all of my colleagues, and so I felt like I had no choice but to leave.
I just want to quote you. You say there is a segment of the activist left, which includes some Jews, that has removed Jewish Israelis from their sphere of moral concern, and that has dehumanized them. The challenge is to hold on to everyone's humanity.
Yeah, I still believe that. I think that that's that's true. And then I wrote those lines as a critique of the left, but I also would think that critique could be turned to Jewish communities as well. I mean, as I've spent more time in American Jewish communities because of the book, I've on the one hand have found on some people a greater willingness to hear things. And at the same time, I've also had to, been very dismayed to see people who are also cheering violence, who are also celebrating wanton destruction. And so, this is for me, this is a moral rule, and it applies to the left, and it also applies to Jewish communities. I mean, I don't know how people can be, indifferent to I mean, I know intellectually, but morally, I can't relate to why people could be indifferent to the human suffering that we're seeing coming out of Gaza right now. And my challenge to the American Jewish community would be the same as it is is in substance the same as it was to the left in the wake of October 7th. Like, we have a moral obligation not to accept this.
I want to just get to your prognosis of the future of Jewish life, because it's a little grim, I've got to say. I'm a member of Central Synagogue. It's pretty vibrant. It's pretty packed on Friday nights. But I've traveled the country. I know that's not the case everywhere. And I've seen and been invited to very hospitably amazing, beautiful places. But we can see there's it's anemic in many places, and particularly in the seminaries, where you point up the small number of the enrolled in JTS, at HUC, at Hebrew College, at the Reconstructionist. Like, we're talking much smaller numbers these days, and we can diagnose a million ways of how, but just in terms of institutional Jewish life, without denigrating anybody, just because I'm allergic to that as someone who's part of an institution I believe in. But you're definitely painting a picture we have to reckon with. And what's that picture for you?
I mean, I think I'll try to paint it in kind of more drier sociological terms.
You can be a little more honest than that.
Look, I've gotten this response from people who are involved in those synagogues, like Central Synagogue, or as you mentioned, or I gave a talk at Temple Emmanuel in
Boston.
Newton. These are in Boston. These are exceptions. These are like the last law. There's also a few in LA, but like generally speaking, the era of the massive reform or conservative synagogue is over. And that in part has to do with content, but it also has to do with sociology. And what I mean by that is that the denominations, this is part of the end of the American Jewish century, took shape really in the post-war period. as containers for a form of American Jewish identification that kind of resembled American religious practice writ large. I mean, this is something Nathan Glazer writes about in his famous book, American Judaism. American Jews had a strange experience of modernity in that we returned to synagogue because synagogue became the receptacle for Jewish identity. The denominational era is over. They're not, I mean, I don't, and by that, I don't mean that JTS or HUC are going to go away. They're big institutions, they have endowments there. I imagine their strategic plans take them into the next century, but there aren't people who are interested, or there aren't as many people who are interested in being part of those institutions anymore. And that has to do with broader changes in American culture and American religious life. You know, church attendance is down. The mainline Protestant denominations are also, you know, experiencing a rather parallel collapse to, say, conservative and reform in institutional structures. So it's not just a Jew, like this isn't just a Jewish problem. Mm-hmm. But I also think, I mean, this is part of what I tried to argue in the conclusion of Tablet Shattered is that we often think of this kind of decline in catastrophic terms, but decline can go on for a really, really, really long time. And so it's not like, oh my God, there won't be shuls anymore or liberal shuls anymore. It just might be they'll have to adapt to not being able to make like outside of the urban or a committed core 12, you know, synagogues that most won't be able to make regular minyanim, and they'll adapt or they'll fold into each other. People also care less about the denominations in general. I mean, there are non-denominational rabbinical schools like Hebrew College that actually seem to have more interest and an uptick in enrollment. And part of that has to do with politics and a sense that there's a wider range of political opinion that's acceptable in a place like Hebrew College. But again, I think it in general, it has to do with the decline of institutional religion in the West as like a macro sociological phenomenon.
And you have some suggestions of like pillars for the future. Can you give us just a sense of maybe a couple?
Sure. I mean, the book ends with what I call a call for the reappreciation of the radical potential of traditional Jewish practice. And what I mean by that is that, let me just go back to one other thing. Part of my critique of American mainstream Jewish life is that it identified too closely with America and American culture and took American values to be synonymous with Jewish values. In doing so, it lost important things about Jewish life that are distinct and different from American life. And so a great example of that is say, Shabbat observance. Shabbat observance puts you outside of the American mainstream because you can't use money and you can't drive and you can't cook and you cannot participate in market exchange. You can't go to the mall and all the things that like kind of liberalist suburban American Jewish life was built around. I happen to think that, you know, a return to Shabbat observance, a return to more traditional observance in general, but that's maybe in the practical level. I also, at the maybe intellectual level, I think going back to maybe the basics of Judaism and rediscovering the concept of obligation, thinking about the meaning of mitzvah, not as something that I choose to do when it feels comfortable and when I like to do it, but as an overarching demand put upon me from outside. And I don't think we have to get into theology. You can say there's lots of ways that you can justify that because, you know, this is the way our communities live for a really long time. And I believe in upholding the life ways, the folk ways of Jewish life. I think obligation also takes us into a way of approaching both people in need and people outside of the Jewish world in a different way, where we recognize our moral obligation to the stranger and to the poor. There's no reason, as I argue in the book, why a reappreciation of the traditional aspects to Judaism has to come with a turn to the right politically. I actually think that there's some radical redistributionist elements of Jewish tradition that are not quite observed and paid attention to by much of liberal Judaism, that if you were looking for a progressive Jewish content, to use that word, like there's no shortage of it in the text. And then I guess which leads me to maybe the last thing, which is the text. Jewish tradition, like Judaism, is a textual religion. And what we find in the texts is a real capaciousness, and also you can't have a substantive Jewish argument without an engagement with the text. I think to go back to what I tried to say earlier on, a lot of the problem with the kind of education that you get in, say, the mainline, whatever federation style community that I grew up in, is there's not a lot of text. There's a lot of feeling. There's a lot of Israel. But there's not a lot of text. And so when one thing falls away, there isn't anything else. When, say, Israel can't be a moral beacon, but it's something, I'm not even saying people who become activists, but becomes complicated because something people don't want to identify with. They don't have very much substantively left in terms of being able to know what Judaism means to them. I mean, one last thing I'll say, just because I think it's important, I don't want to be misunderstood, is that I think there's been a tacit agreement between both, let's say, like Orthodox non-pluralists and liberal pluralists, that inclusion and obligation are mutually exclusive. So on the Orthodox side, they say, we are obligated to halakha, and our interpretation of halakha is the interpretation of it, and it means all of these various exclusions and things. And then you also have the kind of liberal side of things, which says, yeah, halakha, traditional observance, is exclusive. We don't want anything. We have to do the pick and choose option because the framework of obligation is inherently exclusive. And I think there's been a collusion here. And something I tried to highlight in the books are some of the initiatives that people have to merge inclusivity and obligation. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think there are lots of communities from, let's say, on the Orthodox end of, partnership minyanim and the women like being ordained as even Orthodox rabbis,
and you mentioned
LGBT
Svara, B'nai Lapi.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah. So
great example.
These are the new frontier. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that they are the new frontier in the sense that that's where the dynamism in the American Jewish life is. It is also true, and I don't mean this as harsh a critique as it might sound, that these initiatives are never going to appeal to the majority of American Jews. They're never going to represent the majority of American Jews, and they're never going to replace the old consensus, this kind of sense of unity, whether it was real or imagined, that kind of characterized 1945 until now. We just live in a different time. It's too polarized, it's too fragmented, not just over politics, but over individual practice and idiosyncrasies. And the emphasis is on different things. And so we're not going back to like the 1,000 family suburban synagogue. But I think that's actually okay. And that was one of the things that maybe got lost in the argument of the book a little bit. It appears in the end and at the beginning, but the book is not a lament for a golden age. It's not a nostalgic book. People have compared my framing a little bit to the journalist Franklin Foer's article that got a lot of attention in The Atlantic about the end of the golden age. But I'm much more ambivalent about, like, I don't
how golden it was. It wasn't so golden.
It wasn't, and to my mind, it wasn't so golden. I made the joke, like, it's not the age of the golden age of American Jewry. It's the age of the golden calf for American Jewry, where we abandoned a lot of things that were really necessary to maintaining a meaningful and intentional and obligated Jewish life for kind of easy things.
Yes, I want to actually just point out, even though I don't love pointing people to other media, they should stick with JBS. But you did a really rich interview with your wife on 1840, the podcast, with an Orthodox rabbi. And in a way, he gives people permission to hear some ideas that I think are very hard for a lot of people to listen to right now, and me included. It demands our attention. It demands that we actually enter in an uncomfortable place right now, I think, particularly post-October 7th. And so I point people to listen to that episode. I think it was called Teshuva. We have to end, Joshua, but I want to actually end with God, because you're obviously on a journey in terms of your own observance, and I imagine your conversation with the divine. You said at one point, you wrote, while I had spent years of my life praying each morning, I had never felt a connection to the divine the way these men did, you were referring to. God for me has always been an awful absence, a commanding void, than the source of all things, a good in life, or a good of life. Where are you today? Like, is that still a struggle?
I think for any thoughtful person, it always will be a struggle. How do you reconcile, the existence of pain and suffering in the world with the idea that it was created for a reason? Like, I think that that's kind of like the baseline theological challenge that a lot of people have. I will say that over the process of getting married and beginning to think about making a family and spending a lot of time with family has brought me much closer into touch with the sense of good that maybe was lacking whereas the angst of absence was more intense feeling as a young man in my mid and late 20s. But it's a challenge. I mean, it's a challenge that I think is borne out in the text. I mean, last Shabbat in Shul we read Kohelet, and speaking of permission structure, Kohelet is an amazing text because there's just about every pessimistic, doubtful, fearful thought that a person can have about the value of human endeavor and life on earth in that text. And what I like about it so much, and what I think makes it special in the Jewish tradition, is that there's no pretending about the reality of things, about finitude of human life, and about suffering. It's in a way it's a religion it gives us religion for adults, and so that I wouldn't want the wrestling to end, because the wrestling is part of the task that we have on earth.
In many conventional, traditional Jewish spaces right now, Peter Beinart, whatever you think of his past work, is kind of is off limits. It's too controversial and somehow like a contagion that people don't want. He knows that, so I would say it to him if he were here. Why should someone say, I want to have Joshua Leifer come and talk about this book, and it won't somehow contaminate my pro-Israel, pro-Zionist community? Like, why should they come and listen and invite you to hear about Tablet Shattered?
I mean, I think that there are many reasons why they should come in here to hear Tablet Shattered. I'll start by saying that I think if someone genuinely feels that, they should also feel ashamed that they've given their community such a flimsy ability to grapple with challenging ideas, that one guest speaker might derail and unravel their thinking. I mean, if you have given your community a strong foundation to understand the reality, then they can handle someone describing it, or they should be able to handle someone describing it, or in terms that they might not like. And I think in some sense, there's maybe even a responsibility to engage with opposing views and ones we might find challenging. I'll be honest that I haven't always understood the fatwa that's been placed on Peter, because I think that he's actually a rather reasonable person, and does speak from a sense of real Ahavat Israel, even if there are people who disagree with the conclusions that he's reached. And
I should clarify that I don't mean that he will contaminate people's thinking like they're not strong enough, resilient. Right. It's more that he has written himself out of a Zionist story because he's advocating for things that would destroy the state. That's what many people feel.
I mean, I don't think that's my understanding of what he's arguing is a little bit different. And I don't want to, I would prefer him.
Yes, he will defend himself.
I would prefer for him to defend himself and defend his views. I mean, I think Tablet Shattered is a very different kind of book, and the reason why it's a different kind of book than, say, what Jewish Currents or what Peter has done is that it endeavors to be in conversation precisely with those communities. So I am interested in having a conversation with those people. We might disagree on some of the terms, but I view those congregations and those people as my audience. I think Peter might have a different sense in some ones of where his audience is these days. I also think that it's funny because as I've gone on the speaking circuit, the Israel politics is not necessarily the hardest part of the book for people to hear. And in some sense, the appreciation of orthodoxy, the critique of liberal religion has found just as many discomforted faces in the audience as the Israel. It depends on where you're speaking. A Reconstructionist temple in Montclair is like, fine, where the Israel stuff doesn't face us, but this Orthodox stuff, that's maybe a little bit harder. Obviously, at Temple Manuel, the Orthodox stuff's like, that's nice, but we're really like agitated about but I think that I wanted to disrupt the conventional ways of thinking about these things, and the basic assumptions. And I think
you've done that.
Well, that's the best. That's the best thing an author can hear.
Joshua Leifer, thank you so much. The book is called Tablets Shattered: The End of an American Jewish Century and the Future of Jewish Life. I'm Abigail Pogrebin for In the Spotlight. I will see you next time.